10 Messerschmitt fighters owned the sky over Bavaria. High above southern Germany, the German interceptors circled like hawks waiting for prey. Their engines cut through the thin winter air while ground controllers guided them with calm, confident voices over the radio. Below them, a lone P-51 Mustang burst through a layer of cloud nearly 3,000 feet lower. The pilot was new. No wingmen. No altitude advantage. No obvious escape route. For the German pilots watching from above, the situation looked simple. Another American fighter had wandered into the wrong patch of sky. The hunt began immediately. Radio traffic flared across the Luftwaffe frequency channels. Short commands, angles, altitude calls, vector corrections from ground controllers tracking the intruder. The voices sounded confident, controlled, professional. Everything about the situation suggested the American pilot would soon be shot down. Then something strange happened. The tone of the radio traffic changed. Confidence turned to urgency. One by one, the interceptors began losing position. The lone Mustang slipped through the tightening net. And before the German fighters could close the trap, the American aircraft disappeared back into the clouds, into weather too thick and dangerous for the interceptors to follow. Moments later, the sky was empty. Somewhere below the clouds, the Mustang was gone. And Luftwaffe controllers were demanding answers. How had a single rookie pilot slipped through the most concentrated fighter screen in southern Germany? The air war at its most brutal. It was March 1945. The air war over the Third Reich had entered its final and most violent phase. American bombers now struck deep inside Germany almost daily. Massive formations of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed the Alps and the Danube Valley on their way to rail yards, oil depots, and aircraft factories that still fed the German war machine. The Luftwaffe had been battered by years of combat. But it was not finished. Not yet. Around Munich, Augsburg, and Regensburg, fighter bases still operated at desperate capacity. Fuel was scarce. Replacement pilots arrived with barely enough training to take off and land. Spare parts were cannibalized from damaged aircraft. But when the weather cleared and American bombers approached, the Germans still rose to meet them, sometimes in large coordinated swarms. The science of escort. The Americans understood this. By 1945, bomber escort tactics had evolved into something close to a science. The escort system was layered, disciplined, carefully coordinated. P-51 Mustangs flew high cover, protecting the bomber formations from attacks diving out of the sun. P-47 Thunderbolts often swept lower altitudes, hunting enemy fighters trying to approach from beneath. Each squadron had assigned sectors of responsibility. Radio channels were strictly controlled. And above all, one rule governed everything. No one flew alone. 3 years of air war had written that rule in blood. Too many early missions had ended with isolated fighters being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The lesson had been learned the hard way. Formation was survival, the weak link. But those rules assumed something critical. Experience. They assumed pilots who had flown dozens of missions. Pilots who could read the sky instinctively. Men who knew how to interpret contrails, sun angles, and closing speeds in a split second. By early 1945, that assumption was becoming dangerously unreliable. The war was consuming pilots faster than training programs could replace them. Some new fighter pilots arrived at their squadrons with less than 300 hours of flight time. On paper, that was enough to qualify. In reality, it meant they knew how to fly, but not yet how to survive. The rookie, Second Lieutenant William R. Beyer, arrived at the 357th Fighter Group in mid-February. He was 22 years old. His Mustang checkout was complete. His combat missions flown. 0. His squadron mates greeted him in a drafty Quonset hut that smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, engine oil, and damp wool. They offered advice the official manuals never mentioned. How to spot the glint of sunlight reflecting from a distant canopy. How to clear your tail every 8 seconds. How to recognize the moment when you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. Beyer listened carefully. He asked few questions. He wrote nothing down. First missions. His first mission came on March 7th. A bomber escort to an industrial target near Kassel. For hours in the air, he stayed in formation, followed his flight leader, watched the silver shapes of other Mustangs sliding through the sky around him. He saw nothing. No enemy fighters. No combat. When he landed, His hands ached from gripping the control stick too tightly. No one mentioned it. Every rookie did the same thing. The second mission was similar. Long hours. Cold cockpit. Endless scanning of empty sky. The third mission brought something new. Flak. Black bursts blossomed around the bomber formation like deadly flowers. Explosions at 10,000 feet. Shrapnel flying blindly through the air. Bayer felt himself flinch instinctively inside the cockpit. He learned what it meant to trust thin aluminum skin and luck. On the fourth mission, he finally saw the enemy. A Focke-Wulf 190 chasing a crippled B-17 flying Fortress 2 miles away. Before Bayer could react, another Mustang dove toward the German fighter. The FW-190 broke away instantly and vanished into the clouds. Bayer never fired a shot. He was learning, but he was still a rookie. The killing ground. The 357th Fighter Group operated under the 15th Air Force, based in Lecce, Italy. Their missions often ranged north across Austria and southern Germany. It was dangerous territory. Mountains interfered with radar. Cloud layers sometimes stacked 15,000 feet deep. German fighters could hide in valleys and appear suddenly above American formations. In the previous 2 weeks, the group had lost 4 pilots. None of them had flown more than 8 missions. The mission to Bavaria. On the morning of March 17th, Bayer received his most dangerous assignment yet. A long-range escort mission deep into Bavaria, near the Austrian border. The target was an airfield complex near Neuburg and Donau. Intelligence reports warned of heavy fighter opposition. The weather forecast made the situation worse. Broken clouds at 8,000 feet. Solid overcast above 12,000. Poor visibility. Possible icing. The briefing officer did not soften the message. The Luftwaffe had been massing fighters in this sector. They were protecting jet bases and supply depots, the last fragments of a collapsing regime. Desperate enemies were often the most dangerous. Pre-dawn. Before sunrise, Bayer walked across the cold Italian airfield toward his Mustang. His breath formed white clouds in the air. Ground crews moved quietly between aircraft preparing them for takeoff. His crew chief gave him a thumbs up. The Merlin engine started smoothly. Oil pressure steady. Fuel tanks full. Drop tanks secured beneath the wings. 6. 50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. Everything looked perfect. Takeoff came in staggered pairs. 16 Mustangs climbed through layers of gray cloud and assembled by radio instructions and careful timing. The formation headed north. Through thick cloud. Through silence. Through cold air that froze moisture on the canopy. At 18,000 feet, they finally broke into sunlight. Above them stretched a brilliant blue sky. Below them the cloud layer looked like an endless white ocean. Ahead, the bomber stream appeared. Hundreds of B-24 Liberators, flying in tight formations. Their contrails stretched behind them like chalk lines across the sky. The Mustangs slid into escort positions. High, low, left, right. Bayer held position close to his flight leader. Scanning, waiting, watching. Everything seemed calm. Then the radio crackled. A voice cut sharply through the silence. Bandits, high 11 o'clock. And suddenly the sky was no longer empty. The veterans taught him to scan the sky in segments, not wide sweeps. Never trust your eyes to wander. Divide the sky into sections. Check one, then another, and every 8 seconds, without exception, check behind you. You're 6 o'clock. They repeated that rule constantly. 8 seconds. No longer. Because most pilots who died in their first 5 missions died for a simple reason. They never saw the attack coming. Situational awareness mattered more than marksmanship. You could miss every shot and still return home. But you could not return home if someone shot you from behind before you even knew he was there. William Bayer listened carefully. He didn't talk much. He watched. He absorbed everything. After every mission, he replayed the flight in his mind. Where he had scanned. Where he had hesitated. What he had missed. Sometimes nothing obvious appeared wrong. But something had still felt off. He filed those sensations away. Little fragments of instinct beginning to form. That instinct would eventually become the difference between life and death. But instinct takes time. And time was the one thing no pilot could count on. The squadron around him was divided between veterans and replacements. The veterans moved with quiet efficiency. They spoke calmly on the radio. Even when combat erupted, their movements inside the cockpit were economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. They had already survived mistakes that should have killed them. Luck had helped. Skill had helped. But experience was the real difference. They had learned how quickly the sky could turn against you. They carried that knowledge silently. It showed in small ways. The way they checked their guns twice before takeoff. The way they studied weather maps longer than anyone else. The way they sometimes answered rookie questions with silence. The replacements were easier to read. Nervous energy. Forced confidence. Jokes that sounded louder than they needed to be. Everyone was trying to prove something. Trying to belong. Trying not to be the man who made a mistake that killed someone else. Bayer recognized the feeling. Because he felt it too. The difference was that he kept it hidden. When he wasn't flying, he read after-action reports. Stacks of typed pages stored in the operations tent. Accounts of dogfights. Mistakes. Victories. Losses. He studied German tactics. How enemy fighters used the sun for concealment. How they used altitude to control engagements. How they picked off bombers or fighters that drifted away from the main formation. He memorized aircraft profiles. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, with its tight climb performance. The Focke-Wulf 190, with its brutal roll rate and powerful armament. He learned how German pilots tried to lure Mustangs into vertical climbs where the lighter 109 could gain an advantage. He learned something else too. The Mustang's strength was speed. Speed and energy retention. If you fought on the enemy's terms, you were already losing. Knowledge helped. But knowledge was not the same as experience. And experience could not be rushed. On his fifth mission, Bayer saw his first bomber destroyed. A B-24 Liberator flying steady within the formation suddenly shuddered. Then its wing folded backward. The entire aircraft tumbled through space like a broken toy. Pieces tore away. Men fell with them. Bayer counted 3 parachutes before the bomber disappeared into the clouds. The Liberator carried 10 crewmen. He forced himself to keep scanning the sky. There was nothing he could do. The mission continued. On his 7th mission, he fired his guns for the first time. A Focke-Wulf 190 flashed across his nose chasing another Mustang. Bayer rolled into position, pulled lead, pressed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns thundered. The vibration rattled his teeth. Tracers streaked forward through empty air. Too far. Too late. The German fighter vanished into a cloud. Bayer released the trigger. His hands were shaking. He flexed his fingers and forced himself back into formation. Another lesson. Another tiny improvement. By mid-March, he had flown 9 missions. No victories. No damage. Still alive. Still learning. But the veterans could feel it. The enemy could too. A rookie moved differently. He scanned differently. Sometimes he flew too tight. Sometimes too loose. Sometimes he hesitated just long enough to reveal his inexperience. The Luftwaffe had been fighting American fighters for 3 years. They knew what inexperience looked like. And they knew how to exploit it. The problem was not courage. Most rookie pilots were brave. The problem was mathematics. By 1945, Germany had already lost the air war. Fuel shortages grounded entire wings. Pilot training programs collapsed. Factories that once produced aircraft by the thousands struggled to deliver even dozens. Everyone involved understood the outcome was inevitable. But knowing the war was lost did not mean surrendering. The Luftwaffe had orders. Defend the Reich. Bleed the bombers. Protect what remained of Germany's infrastructure as long as possible. Those orders produced a brutal strategy. Concentrate every remaining fighter. Mass them at key interception points. Throw them at the American formations in coordinated waves. Trade aircraft for bombers. Trade pilots for time. Make the Americans pay for every mile they flew. It was a strategy born from desperation. But it could still be effective. American bomber losses had fallen dramatically since the disastrous missions of 1943, when unescorted raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg had suffered catastrophic casualties. Long-range escort fighters changed everything. First the P-38 Lightning, then the P-47 Thunderbolt, and finally the P-51 Mustang, with range long enough to escort bombers all the way to Germany and back. By 1945, bomber formations rarely flew without fighter protection. Confidence grew. Mission planners scheduled strikes that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. But escort duty was still complicated. Fighters faced a constant dilemma. Stay close to the bombers and react defensively. Or range ahead and attack German fighters before they reached the formation. Stay too close and the enemy dictated the fight. Range too far, and gaps opened in the escort screen. Gaps the Germans could exploit. German controllers watched carefully for those gaps. They tracked bomber formations from the moment they crossed the coast. Radar stations, ground observers, radio intercept units. They predicted routes, timing, altitude. Fighters waited in loose formations at high altitude, invisible against the glare of the sun. When an opportunity appeared, they struck. For Messerschmitts diving together. One high-speed attack, then climbing back into altitude before the escorts could react. If American fighters chased them, the Germans forced them into vertical fights where the Bf-109 excelled. If the Americans stayed with the bombers, the Germans reset and attacked again. It was a knife fight in a dark room. The Americans had more knives. The Germans knew the room. For rookies like Bayer, the sky often looked like pure chaos. Veterans saw patterns. They recognized attack setups before they fully formed. They positioned themselves accordingly. Rookies saw everything too late. By the time they understood the geometry of the fight, the enemy was already inside their decision loop. Reaction times that felt fast on the ground became painfully slow at 400 miles per hour. Mistakes multiplied. Fixating on one aircraft meant missing another. A delayed roll meant losing angle. A missed radio call meant losing formation. And losing formation meant death. Training programs tried to prepare pilots for this reality. Two ship elements. Mutual support. Radio discipline. Never fly alone. Never lose sight of your wingman. Never chase a single target out of the fight. The rules were clear. But rules only worked if instinct supported them. And instinct required experience. On March 17th, the weather added a final complication. Forecasts had predicted scattered clouds. Instead, southern Germany lay under a thick overcast. Cloud layers stacked from 8,000 feet to well above 15,000. Inside the clouds, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Ice began forming on wings and canopies. The sky turned into a maze. A perfect environment for fighters to become separated. And separation was exactly what the Germans were waiting for. Clouds turned the sky into a maze. Radio signals weakened as aircraft climbed and descended through thick layers of moisture. Voices crackled through static, fragments of commands breaking apart before they reached their receivers. For the bombers, the weather was an inconvenience. They flew in rigid formation, guided by instruments and navigation crews. Tight boxes of B-24 Liberators continued steadily toward the target. For the fighters, the situation was far more dangerous. Escort pilots had to maneuver through clouds where visibility vanished instantly. A single wrong turn could put a Mustang into the path of another aircraft, or into the side of a mountain. Every pilot flew by instruments one moment and by sight the next. The transition between the two was where mistakes happened. The Germans knew this. They used the weather like another weapon. Waiting above the clouds, Luftwaffe controllers positioned their fighters above the cloud deck, where the air was clear and visibility perfect. From there, they watched the American contrails appear whenever the bomber formations climbed through the cloud tops. They waited for the moment when American pilots transitioned from instrument flying back to visual flight. That moment was chaos. Formations spread slightly. Aircraft adjusted altitude. Radio chatter increased. Cohesion weakened. That was when the Germans struck. High cover. Bayer's squadron flew high cover, 2,000 feet above the bomber stream. Their job was to weave across the formation's flanks and intercept diving attackers before they reached the bombers. The briefing had made the assignment sound routine. But as the formation pushed deeper into Bavaria, the tone of the radio calls began to change. Other escort groups were reporting contacts. Bandits at 10 o'clock high. Bandits breaking through the low cover. Bandits climbing through the clouds. The sky was filling with German fighters. Bayer scanned continuously. High. Low. 6 o'clock. Repeat. His neck began to ache. The glare of sunlight made his eyes water. Contrails stretched across the sky like white scars. Mustangs flashed silver in the distance. Below him, the bomber formation looked like a dark metal river sliding across the countryside. And then he saw it. A small flash of light, high at 11 o'clock. Maybe 2 miles away. Fast. Moving. He reached for the radio. But someone else had already spotted the threat. Multiple contacts. 9 o'clock descending. The sky explodes. His flight leader broke left. Bayer followed instantly. He rolled smoothly into the turn, keeping his leader centered in his canopy. Everything happened quickly after that. The German fighters did not arrive from one direction. They came from three. Bayer saw dark aircraft diving out of the sun. Another group climbing out of a cloud bank to the east. A third slashing across the bomber formation's nose. The radio exploded with voices. Mustangs scattered across miles of sky. The carefully organized escort formation dissolved into dozens of individual dogfights. His leader called out a pair of Messerschmitt Bf 109s lining up on AB 24. Break left. Take the high one. Bayer rolled hard. The G-forces pressed him into the seat. The two German fighters split apart as the Mustangs closed. His leader fired a burst. Both 109s broke away. One diving, one climbing. Bayer instinctively chased the one that climbed. The mistake. The German pilot pulled his aircraft into a steep climb. The Bf 109 had a powerful engine and excellent climb performance. The distance between them slowly increased. Bayer pushed his throttle forward. The Mustang surged. 19,000 feet. 20,000. 21. The Messerschmitt still pulled away. Bayer lowered his nose slightly to gain speed, then pulled into a climbing turn to cut the angle. For a moment, he thought he might close the distance. Then the German rolled inverted and dove back toward the clouds. Bayer hesitated. Doctrine was clear. Never follow an enemy into clouds. Inside cloud cover you lost visual contact. You lost awareness. You became easy prey. But the German was escaping. One more second, and Bayer might have a firing solution. He pushed the stick forward and dove into the overcast. Blind. The world vanished. Gray. Total gray. Visibility dropped to 0. Bayer shifted instantly to instruments. Altimeter. Airspeed. Artificial horizon. He descended through 2,000 feet of cloud, chasing a fighter he could no longer see. His heart pounded in his ears. The Mustang rattled slightly in the turbulence. He turned slowly, hoping the Messerschmitt would appear below the clouds. The aircraft burst out of the overcast at 7,500 feet. The ground appeared suddenly beneath him. Forest fields. A winding river. An empty sky. No bombers. No Mustangs. No German fighter. Bayer was alone. The realization. His stomach tightened. He turned slowly, scanning. Nothing. He checked his compass. Then his fuel. The fight had lasted less than 10 minutes, but the hard maneuvering had burned fuel faster than expected. He still had enough to reach home, but not enough to linger. He began climbing again, intending to rejoin the bomber stream above the cloud layer. Then his radio crackled. A voice speaking German. He did not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Excited. Alert. Someone had spotted him. The net. Bayer scanned the sky. High to the west. Contrails. Several. Descending. His mind raced. He had no wingman. No altitude advantage. And now German fighters were above him. Running was the only option. But where? He pushed the nose down. The Mustang accelerated rapidly. 200 knots. 250. 300. The ground rushed upward. Fields and villages blurred beneath the wings. He leveled off just 500 feet above the ground, racing across the countryside. Behind him the contrails spread out. The German fighters were forming a net. They did not dive immediately. They spread into pairs, each pair covering a possible escape route. Bayer counted them. 8, maybe 10. The trap. They were not rushing the kill. They were hurting him, forcing him toward a place where one of them would have a clean shot. Bayer realized the trap immediately. He needed speed. The Mustang was faster than the Bf 109 in level flight at low altitude. If he could build enough speed, he might outrun them. But to accelerate, he needed to fly straight. And flying straight made him an easy target. He saw a ridgeline ahead. Steep, covered with trees. He aimed directly for it. Behind him, the lead pair of Messerschmitts dove for attack position. Bayer waited. His airspeed climbed past 350 miles per hour. The ridge grew closer. 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 At the last moment, he pulled sharply upward. The Mustang cleared the ridge by less than 100 feet. The Messerschmitts followed and hesitated. The terrain was too tight. The trees too close. One pilot pulled up immediately. The other tried to follow. Bayer dove down the far side of the ridge. Gravity added even more speed. The Mustang flattened out just above the treetops. The engine roared. The wind screamed past the canopy. For 3 seconds, the German pilot lost sight of him. 3 seconds was enough. Bayer broke hard right, rolled inverted, and sliced into a narrow canyon between forested hills. The Messerschmitts overshot. They climbed sharply to avoid the terrain. Gone. Bayer leveled out beneath the ridge line. Invisible from above. He turned north, then west, changing heading every 30 seconds. Staying low, staying fast. High above him, the German fighters circled in confusion. Their radio chatter grew angry. They had lost visual contact, but they were still searching. Bayer knew the hunt was not over. Sooner or later someone would see him again. He needed cloud cover. Ahead of him, towering upward like a white mountain, rose a massive cumulus cloud. It stretched from 8,000 feet to well above 20,000. He pulled back on the stick and began climbing. The Merlin engine screamed. The Mustang clawed upward. 2 Messerschmitts saw the move. They dove. Tracers flashed past his wingtip. Bayer pushed the throttle to maximum. The aircraft surged into the cloud base and disappeared. Inside the cloud, everything turned white again. Bayer flew by instruments. Climbing, turning, blind. The German fighters circled outside the cloud, waiting for him to emerge. But he never did. At 12,000 feet, he leveled off inside the cloud layer, reduced power, turned west, and flew by compass alone. 10 minutes later, he emerged from the far side of the cloud bank. The sky behind him was empty. Below him, the Alps stretched across the horizon. The Germans were gone. Bayer checked his gauges. Fuel, barely enough. Engine temperature, high but safe. Radio, working. He was alive. He was alone. And he had just escaped 10 German fighters. He had slipped through 10 German fighters and survived. Now the real question was whether he could make it home. Bayer glanced at the fuel gauge. 60 gallons. Enough, if everything went perfectly. He ran the numbers automatically in his head. Distance, airspeed, consumption. If he climbed higher, the thinner air would reduce fuel burn. If he stayed low, he would remain hidden from German fighters still searching the area. He chose a compromise. Leveling off at 8,500 feet, he leaned the fuel mixture carefully and settled the Mustang into an efficient cruise. The Merlin engine smoothed into a steady drone. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, the sky was quiet. No contrails, no radio calls, no flak bursts, no bombers. Just open air and the jagged white spine of the Alps stretching across the southern horizon. Replay. His hands were still shaking. He forced himself to breathe slowly. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving exhaustion behind. As he flew west toward Italy, he replayed the fight in his mind. Every decision, every turn, every mistake. Following the Messerschmitt into the clouds had been a clear violation of doctrine. Separating from his formation had been another. 2 errors that should have killed him. But other decisions had worked. Dropping low, using terrain, changing direction unpredictably, exploiting the Mustang's speed where the German fighters hesitated to follow. He had survived not because he was experienced, but because he had refused to behave the way the enemy expected. The German trap. The German fighters had operated like a machine, each pair supporting the other, each pilot covering blind spots and escape routes. It was textbook Luftwaffe swarm doctrine. For aircraft working together. Energy advantage. Altitude advantage. Numbers. Against a rookie flying alone, the trap should have been decisive. It should have ended in seconds. But Bayer had done something unexpected. He had gone low. Lower than the German pilots wanted to follow. Lower than their controllers expected. Into terrain where altitude was suddenly a disadvantage. Speed became survival. And unpredictability became protection. When he needed altitude again, he had used the towering storm clouds the mission briefing had warned about. The Germans had numbers. Bayer had initiative. It wasn't a formal tactic. It was improvisation born from desperation. But it had worked. The voices. He remembered the German radio calls. He could not understand the language. But tone carried meaning. At first the voices had sounded confident. Then impatient. Finally, confused. Somewhere over Bavaria, 10 experienced fighter pilots had watched a lone American rookie refuse to fight the battle they had planned, and then disappear. The realization gave him a brief flicker of satisfaction, but it faded quickly. He still had to reach Italy. The Alps. The fuel gauge continued to fall slowly. Bayer adjusted his course slightly, aiming for the shortest route across the mountains. If his calculations were correct, he would cross the front line near Brenner Pass, and then follow valleys south toward friendly airfields. If he was wrong, The engine would stop somewhere over the Alps, and he would glide into whichever valley he could find, hopefully one controlled by Italian partisans rather than German troops. Minutes dragged past. Below him, forests turned into rocky slopes. Rocky slopes turned into snow-covered peaks. The Alps rose like frozen waves beneath the Mustang's wings. Bayer continued scanning the sky every few seconds, looking for fighters, for flak, for anything. The sky remained empty. The war suddenly felt distant, almost unreal, as if he had flown beyond it. Crossing the mountains. He crossed the mountains at 9,200 feet, threading carefully between two ridgelines. The Mustang's shadow flickered across snowfields thousands of feet below. On the southern side of the range, the terrain softened. Green valleys appeared, rivers winding through farmland. Bayer slowly descended. 8,000 feet. 6,000. 4,000. The engine temperatures dropped. His breathing steadied. Ahead he saw it. An airfield. Buildings. Runways. American markings. He checked the fuel gauge. 20 gallons. Enough. Barely. Landing. He keyed the radio. Tower, this is Mustang 71, requesting immediate landing. The response came back calm and unhurried. Mustang 71, cleared to land. Runway 27. Wind light and variable. Bayer entered the landing pattern. Dropped the landing gear. Lowered the flaps. The Mustang settled smoothly onto the runway. The wheels chirped against the concrete. The aircraft rolled to the end of the strip. He turned onto the taxiway, and the engine coughed once, then died. Out of fuel. Aftermath. Bayer sat motionless for a moment, staring at the instrument panel. His hands felt numb. His back ached. His mouth tasted metallic. Finally, he opened the canopy and climbed out onto the wing. His legs wobbled slightly when he dropped to the ground. A crew chief jogged toward him. He glanced at the empty fuel gauges and let out a low whistle. You glided in on fumes, Lieutenant. Bayer nodded silently. Speaking still felt difficult. Debrief. The debriefing took place in a cramped operations room filled with the smell of coffee and mimeograph ink. Bayer described everything. The separation, the chase, the dive through the clouds, the German fighters boxing him in, the escape through the valley, the climb into the storm cloud. The intelligence officer took notes carefully, occasionally asking questions about altitude, headings, number of enemy aircraft. When Bayer finished, the officer leaned back in his chair. You got lucky, Lieutenant. Bayer didn't argue. You broke formation. You chased a single target into the clouds. You ended up alone with 10 fighters hunting you. He tapped his pencil on the desk. By all rights, you should be dead or in a prisoner of war camp. I know. The officer studied him for a moment. But you also did something right. He nodded toward the notes. You used terrain and weather to break contact instead of trying to dogfight 10 fighters. That shows good judgment. Bayer exhaled slowly. Will there be a report? There's always a report. The lesson. His flight leader confronted him the next morning. You followed a 109 into the clouds. Yes, sir. What happened to the doctrine we briefed? I lost sight of you. I thought I could catch him before he escaped. The flight leader shook his head. You thought wrong. If those Germans had been better coordinated, you wouldn't be standing here. Bayer nodded. Understood, sir. The older pilot studied him for a moment. Then his expression softened slightly. That said, once you were in trouble, you handled it well. Most rookies would have panicked. Bayer hadn't. He kept his speed, used the ground, used the weather, and survived. A new understanding. Bayer returned to his quarters exhausted, relieved, but uneasy. Survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like a warning. The line between living and dying in air combat was thinner than he had imagined. Luck mattered. Equipment mattered. But what mattered most was the ability to adapt when everything went wrong. Over Bavaria, he had learned something. He couldn't yet describe it, but he knew it would matter again. Later intelligence reports slowly pieced together the larger picture. German fighter tactics over southern Germany had evolved. Rather than contesting air superiority directly, they concentrated fighters at geographic choke points, mountain passes, river valleys, and bomber approach routes. They waited for moments of weakness, bad weather, broken formations, isolated aircraft. Then they attacked. In the first 3 weeks of March alone, the 15th Air Force lost 14 fighters over Bavaria and Austria, most of them flown by pilots with fewer than 15 missions. The aircraft weren't the problem. The P-51 Mustang was faster, better armed, and longer range than the German fighters. The problem was tactical, keeping formations intact, preventing rookies from chasing single targets, teaching pilots that survival sometimes meant doing something unexpected. Bayer's report contributed to that lesson. When pilots were low, alone, and outnumbered, they were told one thing: don't dogfight. Run, and run intelligently. Because sometimes the difference between dying over enemy territory and flying home again came down to a single decision made in seconds. Over Bavaria, a rookie had made the right one. In the weeks after the mission, Bayer's escape was studied carefully, not as a heroic story, but as a problem solved under pressure. Intelligence officers and squadron leaders broke the event down into principles that could be taught. Use terrain to mask your position. Change heading frequently to deny enemy tracking. Exploit weather, clouds, fog, low visibility, whenever visual combat becomes impossible. Maintain speed above all else. Do not try to outmaneuver a more agile enemy aircraft. Instead, force it to make mistakes. None of these ideas were revolutionary. Every experienced pilot understood them in theory, but theory and reality were different things. Training could simulate formation flying. It could simulate gunnery. It could even simulate dogfighting. But it could not simulate what Bayer had experienced: being hunted by 10 enemy fighters, alone, over unfamiliar terrain with no support and almost no fuel. What his story provided was something training lacked. A real example. A mental framework for a situation that most pilots hoped never to face. By early April 1945, the lessons from the mission began spreading quietly through fighter groups stationed in Italy. Flight leaders incorporated the ideas into mission briefings. Pilots discussed them during evening card games, during pre-flight inspections, during long waits beside their aircraft. The changes were small, subtle, almost invisible, but they mattered. Fighter losses over Bavaria began to decline. Not dramatically. Combat was still deadly. The Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots and effective tactics. But fewer American pilots were dying from avoidable mistakes. Fewer chased single targets into clouds. Fewer allowed themselves to become separated from their flights. Fewer ended up alone over enemy territory. The numbers shifted just enough for commanders to notice. Sometimes small adjustments save lives. The rookie becomes a veteran. Bayer flew 16 more missions before the war in Europe ended. During that time, he scored 2 confirmed victories: a Messerschmitt Bf 109 damaged on April 2nd, and a Focke-Wulf 190 destroyed on April 21st. Neither engagement was dramatic. Both were quick, efficient, professional, and mostly forgotten by everyone except the men involved. Bayer did not boast about them. He simply flew his missions and returned. Somewhere along the way, something changed. He stopped being a rookie. There was no ceremony marking the moment. No promotion. No announcement. It happened gradually, in the accumulation of small competencies. Knowing when to break formation without being told. Reading the rhythm of a dogfight before it fully developed. Trusting instincts that were now built on experience rather than guesswork. By May, younger pilots began asking him questions. He answered the same way the veterans had answered him. Calmly. Directly, without exaggeration. Focus on what works. Forget what sounds impressive. The war ends. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Bayer was sitting on the wing of his Mustang when the announcement came over the loudspeakers. Men cheered. Some fired flare guns into the sky. Others opened bottles they had been saving for months. Bayer shook hands with the other pilots. Accepted congratulations. Smiled. But the relief he felt was quieter than he expected. He had survived. For him, that was enough. After the war, he returned to the United States in June. By July, he had been processed out of the Army Air Forces. He went home to Pennsylvania. Like many veterans, he spoke little about the war. When people asked what he had done, he answered simply, "I flew fighters in Italy." If they asked for details, he changed the subject. Some experiences were difficult to translate into casual conversation. The fear, the decisions made in seconds. The constant awareness that a small mistake could end everything. Those things did not fit easily into stories told across dinner tables. He went to college on the GI Bill, studied engineering, met a woman in a library. They married. He took a job with a manufacturing company, raised 2 children, built a quiet life. The war slowly faded into the background. He attended a few squadron reunions, exchanged Christmas cards with former pilots. but mostly he moved forward. The historian. Decades later, a military historian researching 15th Air Force operations came across a brief mention of Bayer's mission in a declassified intelligence summary. The report described a lone fighter evading multiple German aircraft using terrain and weather. It recommended that the debrief be circulated for training purposes. A footnote indicated that later mission briefings had incorporated parts of the account. Curious, the historian searched veteran records. Eventually, he located William Bayer, now 81 years old, living in a retirement community in Pennsylvania. The historian called and asked if he would discuss the mission. Bayer agreed. They met in a quiet room overlooking a courtyard. Bayer's hands were spotted with age. His voice was soft but steady. At first he spoke slowly. Then the memories returned. He described the clouds, the German fighters diving from above. The moment he realized he was alone, the canyon that had hidden him from their view. The historian asked if he had been afraid. Bayer considered the question. Yes, he said finally, but not the way people imagine. He paused. I was too busy to panic. In the moment, it was just problem solving. Fuel, speed, terrain, heading. One decision after another. The historian asked if he believed his actions had made a difference. Bayer shrugged. I came home. That was the difference. If my debrief helped someone else come home too, then yes. I suppose it mattered. The real meaning. Before the historian left, Bayer added something else. People think war is about heroism, he said. It isn't. It's about young men trying not to die while doing a job no one should have to do. I wasn't brave. I was scared and stubborn. I survived because my airplane was good, my training was adequate, and I got lucky. The historian later included the story in a book about air combat tactics during the final months of World War II. Bayer received a copy. He read it once, then placed it on a shelf, and never opened it again. The Quiet Legacy. William Bayer died in 2003 at the age of 86. His obituary mentioned that he had served as a fighter pilot during World War II. It gave no details. His children spoke about his kindness, his work ethic, his love of crossword puzzles. No one mentioned the mission over Bavaria, but the lessons endured. Training manuals written after the war incorporated ideas drawn from debriefings like his. Terrain masking, speed management, weather exploitation. Fighter pilots in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts learned tactics rooted in the improvised decisions of men who had fought over Europe decades earlier. The mission itself faded into obscurity. One flight among thousands during a vast war. No medals. No headlines. No dramatic retelling in popular history. It was too small, too technical, too specific. Yet within the quiet archives of military aviation, the lesson remained. When everything goes wrong, when you are alone, when the odds are impossible, you do not surrender to the situation. You adapt. You use whatever you have. Speed, terrain, weather, instinct. You force the enemy to react to you. And sometimes, if you are skilled, stubborn, and just lucky enough, you slip through. One rookie pilot over Bavaria did exactly that. And in doing so, he proved something every fighter pilot eventually learns. Survival is not about numbers. It is not about firepower. It is about thinking faster than the chaos around you. Sometimes that is the sharpest weapon a pilot has. And sometimes, it is enough.